Hello, good afternoon. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Institute, and it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you in the room and the hundreds of you who are joining us online for today's timely event. For those of you who are new to the Duke Margolis Institute, we are an interdisciplinary university-wide program with offices here in Durham and in Washington, D.C. Our program supports the development and implementation of practical, innovative, evidence-based policy strategies to address major challenges in improving health, the value of healthcare, and health disparities. The work requires collaboration, public and private, and across diverse perspectives throughout our healthcare system. With today's event, we're launching our Health Policy Matters series, which will bring together health policy thought leaders and innovators to the Duke campus and to our DC space for constructive, illuminating discussions on some of the leading healthcare challenges and opportunities. And today's event is going to focus on a very timely topic with potentially transformative implications for healthcare and health: artificial intelligence. And for all of you here, you might ask, well, I've just been invited to 10 other events on this general topic in the last week or two. What is going on here today that's so special and different? Here, we're going to focus on some of the important policy issues that accompany health AI and where the path forward on an effective public policy approach is not yet clear. Our work on this topic builds on the existing expertise here across Duke University, which has become one of the national and global leaders on a range of health AI applications. We hope you all who are here in the room got to catch the video spotlights of some of the work here at Duke. We're going to have these available online and after the live event as well. Our work also reflects ongoing Duke Margolis research, analyses, and collaborations in key areas of health policy and health reform to advance innovation, including in digital and AI technology to improve healthcare, health, reduce costs, and address those health disparities. We're going to start with a fireside conversation involving two of the big thinkers in this general area of AI and digital health, Amy Abernethy and Eric Larson, focusing on the policy reform context affecting AI, the context for policy reforms with these transformative changes starting to occur. We're going to emphasize the biggest opportunities for transforming health and healthcare, also the key risks and concerns, including whether and how it may be possible to learn more and faster to maximize the positive impacts of health AI applications. Then, as we transition the stage between sessions, we're going to have some remarks by Mary Klopman, Dean of the Duke School of Medicine, Executive Vice President for Health Affairs at Duke University. And we'll go also into one of those brief video spotlights I mentioned with Nicoletta Economou speaking about some of the important Duke efforts to advance safe and responsible governance of health AI tools in healthcare organizations. Then Dr. Christina Silcox, the Research Director of Digital Health at Duke Margolis, is going to moderate a panel of leaders from major federal agencies. We're very pleased that they took the time and effort to be here today. They have important responsibilities related to the effective development and deployment of health AI tools. As we'll discuss, this work is important but very challenging. It's still relatively early days in understanding benefits and risks, let alone understanding what policy steps can improve the balance of benefits and risks and perhaps can accelerate learning about how to apply AI effectively in healthcare. As I get started, I do want to remind everyone that as part of Duke, we adhere to the university's policies of academic independence on the part of its faculty and scholars. Neither Duke nor the Margolis Institute take partisan positions, but everyone here is free to speak their minds and express their opinions on the important issues we cover. That's critical for the success of our work. So without further delays, Amy and Eric, come on up. Joining me on stage are Eric Larson, the president of PowerBrook Advisors and president emeritus of the advisory board company, where he was dedicated to identifying and promulgating best practices to fundamentally improve U.S. and global healthcare. He's also a venture partner at Thrive Global, which has led the last 3 investment rounds at OpenAI. putting these together. Probably won't surprise any of you that Eric has been focusing on understanding the potential of AI for transformative impacts on health and healthcare and how to realize it. Also, Amy Abernethy, very pleased, Amy, that you're here, back here with us. Amy's a Duke alumnus and a trustee, and most recently is the co-founder of Highlander Health. Amy's career spanned oncology, academic medicine, entrepreneurship, policymaking, including leadership of FDA efforts to address digital health opportunities and challenges while serving as FDA Deputy Commissioner. And now with an innovative new initiative to leverage technology to speed and enrich the evidence available to inform and improve healthcare. So we're going to try to make this event interactive. I think on the next slide, Slido, those in the room, take a picture of it if you want. We'll also have microphones later for those of you online. Please send in any comments or questions that you'd like us to discuss. We'll try to fit in as much as possible. So let's get going. Eric, I want to start with you. You have been, as I mentioned in my introduction, spending a good deal of time with some of the true AI pathbreakers, the fundamental inventors of the generative AI technologies especially, as well as with a lot of diverse healthcare leaders, as well about a few other activities like thinking about the history of civilization. So I don't want to steal the thunder, but I think we're going to see in some of your upcoming writings that you've come to the conclusion that AI, and especially generative AI, is going to be a really big deal, particularly for healthcare, where we certainly had a tremendous amount of biomedical innovation, maybe even some big AI impacts on at least the drug discovery and development process, potential for much more. But we also are still, as of now at least, last time I checked, continuing to see rising costs, labor shortages, burnout, access problems. What do you think is going to be most impactful and different in the next few years as generative AI really comes to healthcare?
Yeah. So Mark, it's a delight to be with you and an honor to be with Amy. Little topics like civilization, altering, technologies,
That's what you do.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I'm cognizant that so much of the discussion around AI, especially AI in healthcare, is characterized by just competition for superlatives, like everybody out hyperventilating everybody else. So I'll be cautious because I actually think the hyperventilation is merited. I mean, you mentioned civilization. You look over the course of human civilization. I mean, back to 4,500 years ago with the advent of writing, right? There probably been 20 to 25 civilization altering technologies, the wheel, the printing press, the agriculture. I mean, these are the things that have progressed human wellness and capability. And, the reason I think Gen AI is so remarkable is when you kind of abstract out the fascinating generative elements, it's about brute force productivity augmentation. And if you look at most of the major automations, especially post-industrial revolution, late 18th century, they've augmented human muscle. They've sort of mechanized human brawn. This one, I think, is potentially mechanizing higher order human cognition. It's potentially multiplying intelligence. And when you think about that, it's sort of limitless in its potential applications, but I spend all my time thinking about healthcare. And I would sort of postulate, I think healthcare in the United States has the greatest surface area exposure to these productivity augmenting capabilities. So why do I say that? Healthcare is the most human intensive industry in the United States. We employ 21.7 million Americans.
And more and more and more.
And more and more and more. There's an average of 1.8 million new healthcare job creations every year. It's interesting. You think about big tech as arguably the most ascendant sector in free markets right now. Last year, big tech, which collectively represents about 17 trillion in market capitalization, so the Mag 7 plus 3, last year they laid off 262,000 employees. Healthcare added 850,000 employees. And disproportionately, a lot of the jobs in healthcare are non-clinical. So from 1970 to today, the number of doctors in the United States increased by 150%. The number of healthcare administrators increased by 3,200%. There are 450,000 administrators in healthcare. Healthcare is the only industrial vertical that has seen negative productivity over the past generation. Technology in every other instantiation is disinflationary, if not deflationary. But as you pointed out, healthcare this year is increasing by 8%. That is the fastest growth rate since the global financial crisis. And so you've got this fascinating juxtaposition between super linear institutions in American medicine, and a super exponential technology. I mean, Moore's law is obsolete. Moore's law would have projected a 100-fold improvement in compute over a decade. The scaling hypothesis is the new Moore's law. We've seen a 100,000x increase in effective compute over the last decade. So what I'm trying to reconcile in my thinking is, how does this technology of unprecedented consequence, arguably the most powerful technology humanity has ever created, which is going to augment and multiply human intelligence, how does it play out across healthcare? And I imagine we're going to talk about administrative simplification, care augmentation, synthetic and computational biology, and then consumer empowerment. But I'm deeply concerned that the institutions in American medicine are not prepared for how dislocating some of these implications are going to turn out to be.
And I think some of you mentioned some of those implications, like much greater workforce productivity. And it sounds like you're not just talking about administrative productivity, you're talking about actually delivering care, clinical decisions, access,
Yes.
ways in which people get access.
Yes.
That all seems to have like a very positive potential connotation to it. But as you say, the reaction so far seems to be sluggish. This wouldn't be the first technological breakthrough that's been relatively slow to have an impact on the healthcare industry. We've heard in the flip side of all of the hyperventilation talk about AI, about the potential downsides, weaponization of this technology, things like that. Now, I'm not talking yet about super taking over human civilization, but in the nearer term, why is this one going to be different? So we've seen like other digital infrastructure revolutions that everyone predicted was going to lead to productivity improvements.
Yes.
They came in other industries. Maybe they're getting there in healthcare. I don't know. I mean, we've spent over the last 15 years more than $50 billion in federal expenditures to support electronic health records, to make healthcare more coordinated and efficient. And I got to say, I don't think we're there yet in terms of those productivity improvements. If you ask frontline healthcare providers, are we sure that this technology, the generative AI, is not going to be sort of weaponized, maybe a too strong of a word, but it seems like it could do a lot to encourage more fee-for-service billing, create a prior authorization arms race, accentuate the less productive aspects of US healthcare?
Yeah, so just very briefly, I think most technology is intrinsically neutral, right? So with the invention of the ship came the invention of the shipwreck, right? There are good things, there are weaponization, there are good and bad externalities, right? I am a constitutional optimist. I think this is ultimately going to be massively deflationary in American healthcare. I think it's going to be democratizing of best practices. I think we're going to have a renaissance in computational and synthetic biology and new biomolecules created. So I'm deep, and I believe consumers are going to be fundamentally empowered by this technology when it reaches fruition. But there's a real chasm between what will eventually happen and where we're at now. Part of that, I think, is on the demand side, right? And by the demand side, I'm going to talk about what is the most oligopolistic industry in the American economy, which is healthcare. It is hyper concentrated. To be a little provocative, I think it's controlled by 150 people. These are the CEOs, the 7 publicly traded managed care companies that on a good day have $1 trillion market capitalization. You got 33 Blue Cross Blue Shield CEOs that collectively insure 1 out of every 3 Americans.
Throw in the big hospital systems, or?
Well, you got a few, top 10 health systems have $350 billion in revenue. Top 100 have $1 trillion in revenue. So it's hyper concentrated. But with that level of incumbency comes a degree of impermeability. I mean, every single tech revolution over the last generation, healthcare skipped or sat out. Internet, mobile, social, cloud, blockchain, big data analytics, enterprise SaaS, healthcare was the last to adopt. So there's a certain imperviousness to healthcare that past technologies have not broken through. This one I think is too powerful.
And can these same oligopolistic institutions who think are going kind of slowly now, waiting to see what happens, maybe seeing if somebody else moves first, can they also blame regulatory policy,
They can.
payment policy?
Absolutely. Look, it's hyper-regulated, hyper-litigious. You make a mistake, it has massive consequences. But I also, for many, I think that's a pretext. I think it's a pretext. Now, I do believe this is going to be transformational. Now, if you look over the course of civilization, the big civilization altering technologies, they broadly created distributed social benefits with localized harms. So healthcare is going to be deflation. There's going to see deflation in healthcare, but a lot of that's going to come from the technological substitution for jobs. We are going to see broad technological unemployment, right?
And not maybe just administrative either, also in some of the.
I think on the clinical side too, and forgive the monologue, I'll just say one thing. I think on the administrative simplification side, you're going to see a lot of substitution of technology for labor. We're already starting to see it in ambient AI, summarization, documentation, coding, et cetera. On the clinical side, I think you're going to see almost a debureaucratization, right? So the typical physician spends 60 to 70% of her time on non-clinical activities. So documentation, summarization, hunting for DME, hunting for pharmacologics, right? I think AI will simplify, automate, eliminate, or augment a lot of those tasks. But ultimately, as a clinical co-pilot, second opinion, the central repository of superior differential diagnostic capabilities. I actually think the technology is already there in some domains. And I imagine when we talk about the reasoning models we're
going to get to that and getting from, maybe we'll even get to from clinical co-pilots, as you said, pilots, but we'll see. But driving all of that, Amy, this has been the center of your career. You've been a leader in innovative methods to use electronic data from clinical care, from increasingly diverse other sources to develop so-called real-world evidence on what works for this patient right here, right now, and through hopefully improving their whole care journey for better outcomes and avoiding unnecessary costs and improving access. And boy, that has been challenging, hasn't it?
Hard.
So lots of AI adoption is starting to go on now. What's front of mind for you to help assure that we're set up to learn as quickly and effectively as we can about the impact of these healthcare applications of AI to maybe change that long trajectory and address some of these concerns that Erica also raised?
So thank you. And it's fun to be here with both of you. You know, first of all, like Eric, I'm pretty bullish. And I just got to make sure that you know my bias on the table. And in fact, my entire career has been about the fact that I'm bullish about where we are now and where we're going to go. I was thinking, so I live in Orlando, there's Epcot in Orlando, there's this big globe at Epcot where when you take the little tour through the globe, it's all of the distinct transformations in civilization. And I was sort of imagining in Eric's journey, we're going to end up with AI on that tour.
Like Eric Larson bot.
Yeah, exactly. Telling everybody why this is like the printing press. And you know, so I do think we're in a very, you know, transformative moment. But based on my lessons learned across time, there are a number of key things we've got to get right. And we've got to continue to work on getting them right now in order to take us towards this future. First is the fact that artificial intelligence, algorithms of any type need data as core substrate. And so we have to really work hard to get our data sets right as a fundamental requirement within the context of healthcare. That means that we need to make sure that our data sets are appropriately available and high quality, that we've dealt with issues around bias, that we've dealt with issues around multimodality, because the best of AI is going to bring together data of all types. And so really lending towards a landscape of bringing the best of biology together with the understanding of clinical context, together with the understanding of social context and environmental context, and what's possible in the healthcare system that this person is being cared for in right now in order to figure out what to do. That kind of multimodality of data is going to be fundamental for our future. We've got to get that right. And then the other thing that has to be true is that, you know, in healthcare, we're trust but verify, right? So I agree that a lot of the reticence that you're describing is incumbency and sort of not in my backyard, but also a lot of it is do no harm and an expectation of documentation of safety and effectiveness. And so the other task is that if we have powerful capabilities with respect to artificial intelligence, we've got to understand what works and what doesn't, and we need to do that at scale. In fact, my worry is that our need for a documentation of effectiveness and performance across time is going to gum up the system because we just don't have enough evidence generation capacity to accommodate evaluating all the artificial intelligence capabilities coming through our pipelines, and basically are all going to be stuck at a place where we're like, well, we don't know, can we use this in our health system or not? So, you know, as I think about our tasks going forward, what's interesting is that we can see a future where we can solve both of those substrate needs simultaneously. Longitudinal, multimodal, high quality, unbiased data that actually serves as a foundational substrate to continuously evaluate artificial intelligence and other medical innovations in our pipelines. And so I think that's the task in front of us. We published on August 5th in JAMA this concept of a modern data infrastructure for evidence generation and clinical trials. And really artificial intelligence in the landscape you're describing is the core task that we need to be ready to evaluate.
So I do want to follow up on that. So this is gonna be another hard question for you. I'll let you take a breath for a minute, but let me go to Eric, see if you got any comments to make now. So Amy spent a lot of time, you know, previously at Flatiron Health and elsewhere, getting at this question of, you know, that is the holy grail for evidence in healthcare and improving clinical medicine is reliable, unbiased, consistent data. Healthcare data is complex, generally not reliable, not simple terminology or one-dimensional, but free text, language, et cetera. Before we get back to the methods, comments about how AI might be able to help with getting to just more reliable and consistent and confident data foundation?
I'm so optimistic about this, and I love everything Amy said resonated with me. I mean, the reality is that most healthcare data is unstructured, right? And you know, there's 150 zettabytes of data in the world. 50 are in healthcare, and healthcare data is increasing by 36% per year. And so there's this
standards are increasing too, but the data is increasing faster.
The data are just proliferating, right? And previously, a lot of that data was just inaccessible. But with the advent of NLP and these multimodal LLMs that can ingest exabytes of data and actually discern patterns and recognize anomalies and extract insights that are, you know, potentially even superior, not just different, but superior to human reasoning, just because of being able to encompass these huge agglomerations of data. And so I am actually very optimistic that we're going to be able to bring order from the chaos when it comes to data. And this high dimensionality data, highly heterogeneous data that previously was sitting dormant. I mean, the average hospital kicks off 50 petabytes of data every year. That's 2x the volume in the Library of Congress. 3% of it has been traditionally used. So for me, I think this has the chance to evolve medicine from a practice to a science.
And with that super exponential growth in computing power, even as more and more of this data gets spun off, in principle, computing is staying ahead of it.
It is. In fact, I don't even think we've touched. So you think about the scaling hypothesis. The scaling hypothesis is that if you just put more capital, more data, more parameters, magic things happen. And these euphemistically called emergent properties, which basically the programmer can't explain how the algorithm developed this capability. So far, the scaling hypothesis over the last decade of deep learning is undefeated. And yet, this 50 zettabytes of data are largely proprietary. they're largely behind the ramparts of these incumbents. Now, there's certain accessible data repositories, et cetera, but I believe a lot of the unlock is in accessing these proprietary data from incumbents. And as the algorithms get more sophisticated and as the GPUs get more sophisticated, I just think we're going to have this potential to actually drive insights, build out new molecules, et cetera. And the quality standard that Amy was talking about right now, there's just a lot of sort of subjectivity, and I think this could bring objectivity.
All right, let's go back to that. But I do want to put a pin in these proprietary and intellectual property concerns, as well as a pin in, when the AI capabilities are really start making these data reliable, and a pin in several other things too that we'll all come back to. But yes, you're going to comment on like how are we going to start making progress on this now? One of the, as healthcare organizations are struggling a bit to adopt these digital health and AI related technologies. There, as you said, Amy, there are a lot of them being developed. Which one is best in an already complex healthcare data systems and process and operational infrastructure? All of that is a big challenge. The first steps that we've seen on regulation in this space are really about, I think it's fair to say, transparency. So the Office of the National Coordinator, who we'll hear from a little bit later, in part of their electronic health record framework, has talked about letting people know when tools are adopted and letting them know what these tools are, what data they were trained on, and so forth. And then an expectation that each organization will develop some assurance and apply assurance capabilities for addressing guardrails, safety risks, things like that. FDA has set up a framework and approved a lot of products, but in terms of, as you said, just being able to use any small fraction even of that data that Eric was talking about, I mean, we're just not there, and boy, we seem to need it to help make these assurance approaches work.
So listening to this, I'm going to divide sort of my response to you in three categories. So the first is kind of going back to your kind of point around the availability and volume of data and our compute power to go along with it. Importantly, not only do we need demand signals that make data available, and one of my examples is imaging data, which is 90% right now of our available data in healthcare is imaging data, and creating demand signals that allow imaging data to flow, to be cloud-based, et cetera, is a good example of how then those available data become ready to be a core part of our overall data substrate. Now, importantly, they're leveraging artificial intelligence to do critical work in data curation, so improving data quality, including unstructured documents, in evaluating data that's sitting in front of us, and algorithm development is key to that task. So that's going to be sort of one critical category. And when we come to the policy side, we can think about demand signals that push for responsible data availability and use. The second is, what do health systems and organizations do to be ready now within this landscape? And one is very frankly something that I think we aspire to, but isn't always a part of our day job, which is a culture of inquiry and asking the core questions: what tools work for me? How am I going to implement them in this system? And what's that going to look like? I was just looking at a paper in JAMA on October 15th from Yale, where they looked at 6 different algorithms for identifying risk of clinical deterioration in the hospital. And what they actually asked was, which algorithm is going to work in Yale Hospital? What's going to work for us? And actually also their aligned network of affiliated sites. And that, first of all, the answer that they got was not what they were expecting, because they were thinking it was going to be the Rothman Index and it was going to be their own Yale Index, and it was not, but rather a proprietary index that came from a vendor. And importantly, asking what works here is part of the culture of inquiry, but also evaluating the performance of models that work here over time. And work that was done here at Duke documented that when models get implemented, that actually changes the day-to-day delivery of care, which fundamentally changes the substrate that may not go along with how those models were initially developed. And so models may need to be updated or may not be applicable for that
So the evidence was good as far as it went, but now it's not relevant anymore.
Right. So you have to be ready to adjust and have the inquiry to do that, whether that is through continuous quality improvement, formalized studies, the right kind of infrastructure, et cetera. The third is we probably should be leaning more on our health services researcher colleagues who've had a whole portfolio of different evaluative frameworks that we've been using for the last 30 years that are going to be needed at this time of continuous evaluation of algorithms, whether those are step wedge designs, pre-post tests, cluster randomized designs. We don't always have to rely on the randomized controlled trial, and we can allocate our randomized controlled trial resources for the right time. So there's a lot to be done in the methods work of how we do this work. And so the last piece is this question of regulation. I know you're going to get to this in the last, in the next conversation.
Oh, I'm going to go after you guys on this too, so don't.
Well, that'll be quiet for me.
No, go ahead.
Well, so the thing I was going to say about regulation is recognizing that right now we're in a time of, I call it the tweener period, right? Like we're still getting it right. We practically speaking have some regulations that we understand and work for us. We understand when this is software as a medical device and how to formally essentially regulate devices. And we have our current regulatory pathways, whether or not they're working as well for us as we would like. We at least understand what those are. And similarly, we have carve-outs where we said, no, this is not necessarily regulated in a formal way by the FDA and may actually sort of fall under self-governance of various types. But practically speaking, that's not going to work for us very long. And if you are an AI-based developer right now, you're not really sure exactly what regulatory landscape is going to apply to you. It may be FDA, it may be CMS through CLIA, it may be what's happening at ONC. So we actually have to start to kind of work through our tweener period and a much more reliable regulatory process in order to make sure all of these products get through.
Okay, I'm not gonna ask about the regulations yet, but I put a pin in this and we're gonna come back to that in just a few minutes. I do have one more follow-up for you in the meantime. As you mentioned, different types of learning in clinical organizations. And on the one hand, within healthcare organizations, especially the larger ones, have pretty much established some kind of plan, do, study, act, quality improvement, step wedge, things where you try out an idea maybe in some part of your organization, see how it goes fairly quickly, look for some early indicators, and then expand it to the other parts. So it's not randomization at the person level, but it's aiming to be something like that. That I don't think is yet infused with either some of the real potential benefits of AI technology that we've been talking about here today. I mean, maybe it's coming, or B, maybe a way that could help scale out the question of, well, does this work here, there, or other places? Can you see more movement towards rapid learning platforms or steps? Isn't this something that was your day job too?
So first of all, I think that we've started having these conversations pretty quickly across the entire healthcare landscape in the AI community, and whether that's conversations around CHAI, so the Coalition for Healthcare AI, asking this question, whether it is directly in research institutions. Penn's been doing this work, Duke's been doing this work. Lots of places are doing this work. The reality is, and I'm going to sort of not poke at any one place, although I could, that we actually don't really know how to do this work at scale yet and have essentially the tools just to teach each other at scale yet. And part of the task is to do the work of essentially creating the checklist of here are all the things that we need to do internally for our organization and how we teach the next organization, acknowledging that not every organization needs all the things that we need here. So essentially you need a mechanism to spread the capability.
And they may be a bit different organization too, in terms of how they're set up, the populations they serve.
I'm having this one set of conversations around essentially organizational readiness. And there was the goal of setting up sort of essentially category 5 readiness. And here's what a terrific institution at category 5 looks like. And, frankly, I don't want to be at an institution where I feel like I'm a category 3 if category 3 is a C on the test. But if you actually think about it, for example, as a level 2 or a level 3 trauma center, which may be right for that community, and other communities need trauma centers with different types of capabilities, then you can actually say, here's what are the capabilities that are needed at our institution in order to implement AI, leveraging the ability to implement, evaluate AI, and continuously assess the organization across time. And that may look different organization by organization. And so I think we're at a place right now where there are a number of efforts, some grassroots, some formalized from the top, that are each trying to figure this out. We need to learn from each other. We need to assume that it's not one size fits all across all the different organizations, and we need to invest in doing this quickly.
Does the same approach apply when you think about clinical trials? So what we've just been talking about is sort of the future of quality improvement, rapid learning, care delivery reform. You mentioned that clinical trials do have a place for, I think you said, bigger questions, and there has been no shortage of activity in your FDA and the current CALIF FDA around advancing real world evidence development through pragmatic clinical trials, ones that would be able to be performed without disrupting clinical pathways. But I gotta say, in contrast to the very remarkable changes that have happened in just a tiny amount of time in the context of research and development for biomedical products, we are not seeing that in clinical trials yet. I mean, the clinical trial cost curve and access curve looks a lot more like the overall healthcare productivity curve. Very expensive, getting more expensive, despite what seemed like a lot of really notable regulatory efforts, guidances, special programs, et cetera. A lot of statements from industry that they're ready to do something different, but I mean, maybe that's another one of those oligopoly things you were talking about before, hard to get people to move.
Well, that actually was, I was just about to say, it is really a good example of how hard it is to make progress and get people to move. There's an interesting statistic that John Euler, CEO of Bayesian, presented at JP Morgan last year, actually January 24, that 2010, it was about $150,000 per patient in Beijing clinical trials. And in 2023, it was north of $300,000 per patient. Wow. The costs of clinical trials are continuing to increase. Yet we're moving into this landscape where our demand for evidence generation is going up and up. We have, true biological innovations like cell and gene therapies, also AI-based products, et cetera, all of which need to be evaluated. And we need to get this right, where we're combining clinical trials using traditional methods with real world data and more novel solutions to get much more of a holistic understanding of all of these products. It's interesting. We need to figure out how to reserve randomization for the questions where they're truly equipoise and where we have to get it right with respect to safety and effectiveness. And we need to fill in our gaps in knowledge with a variety of study designs that not only answer this question right now, but actually sequentially answer questions across time. I think that this is going to become more and more important in AI, where we have to evaluate performance across time.
All right. We've talked about a lot of issues where health AI applications could be potentially transformative. And we've avoided talking very specifically about sort of the policy steps to potentially at least not get in the way, ideally help accelerate, address these balance of benefits and risks and bias and other kinds of challenges, opacity, et cetera. So now we're going to start taking the pins out of these things. Yeah. We put all the pins in them. So the rest of the time, we're going to talk about policy, not at the micro detail level. I don't think that's what's needed right now, but really at the theme levels. What are the big themes that you all might consider to be important as we think about health policy evolution from here? And by that, I don't just mean regulatory restrictions, but also incentives, potentially supports, since this is that's an important area for all Americans. And maybe we could start with one that we pre-discussed a little bit about, and that's transparency. So one of the big concerns about the chatbots of today is that, they sound good. Right. Where did this come from? And that article doesn't actually exist. Yeah. Eric, I know you spent some time with Sam Altman. Sam has his 5 stages or categories, stages of AI evolution. We're at stage 1 now, the chat bots. Stage 2 is reasoning. And reasoning, if it's really reasoning, seems like should encourage and support, especially if policy backs it up, transparency. Yes. Why did you reach that conclusion? Can you show your work? Can you show how you're synthesizing evidence to get less opacity and where these recommendations are coming from? Is that an important direction?
Not only do I think that's the direction of travel, but I will be so bold as to say I think we're almost there. I'm actually stunned at how quickly this is evolving. You know, Sam talks about these 5 stages to AGI, and AGI is one of these like notoriously like nebulous terms that means everything and nothing. You know, Dario Amodei at Anthropic calls it powerful AI, which may be a more tolerable kind of phrasing. But Sam talks about the 5 stages starting as conversational AI, moving to reasoners, moving to agents, moving to autonomous innovators, moving to organization, moving to AGI. And this is fascinating, Mark. I think this mechanistic interpretability problem, which is what the programmers call when you can't explain or the multimodal LLM can't explain its work. I think the new reasoning models, specifically the O1 release from OpenAI, in large measure solves that opacity problem.
And you're talking about a release that's like here and now.
A few weeks old.
Yeah.
I mean, this just came out and it's got many aliases. It was Strawberry, it was Q-Star, and now they've settled on O1. Their nomenclature is still a mystery to me how they arrive at all these things. But I'll say that what they've done to take chain of thought reasoning and embed it into the algorithm. So instead of, you know, Daniel Kahneman Systems 1 thinking, which is largely instantaneous responses, you go to Systems 2 thinking, which is more contemplative, more slow, sort of like reflective thinking. I think what the O1 model does in showing its work, actually taking a minute or more to contemplate. And I'm using the word contemplate knowingly. I mean, there's all these sort of crazy.
Contemplate. You're talking about an LLM. Basically.
I am,
and
look,
real thinking. Or
I mean, here's this. I almost think it's becoming this abstract epistemological debate around what is knowledge, and what is intelligence, and are these things stochastic parrots that just statistically spit out, you know, the next word? Are they glorified autocompletes? Or is there so much wisdom and knowledge and culture embedded in human language that these things are mimicking the reasoning process? I've come to the conclusion that this is close enough to reasoning that I believe it is approximating how we reason through it. Now, it does it in a different way, but the output is the same. And I'm being a little fast on this language because I think approximation is the appropriate descriptor here. But if anybody's played with O1, and you can see it actually, quote unquote, think, it'll show its sort of reason, its rationale. It will backtrack. It will hit a dead end. It will change directions, but you can see it transparently. So Sam and I and the OpenAI team arranged a day to bring some of these healthcare incumbents to do an immersive sort of, I almost characterize it as shock therapy. You know, these are the CEOs of some of the largest health systems and payers in the country, just to give an at the coalface sort of experience of what are the frontier models creating. And we took a JAMA case study and put it into the O1 model and took
one of those harder cases.
One of the harder, it was a complex immunological case. We took out the diagnostics, and the doctors in the room were just hypnotized because it paused, it showed its reasoning, it backtracked, and then it arrived at a differential diagnosis that one of the CEOs who leads the third or fourth largest health system in the country, who's an immunologist himself, said that the reasoning was unimpeachable, the conclusions were correct. And the direction of travel is so quickly here. I'll give you one other quick anecdote. So everybody in Silicon Valley right now is talking about Anthropic's Claude 3.5 release of their agentic platform, which can basically take your mouse, control your computer. And there was a podcast last Friday where 2 reputable Silicon Valley types were talking about an over-under. How quickly would an agentic model be able to go into your computer and book a hotel reservation? And the over-under was 2 years. 72 hours later, Anthropic released its model, and their case study was going in and autonomously booking a hotel. 72 hours versus 2 years. I guess what I'm being a little provocative in saying that the direction of travel is very fast. I think the mechanistic interpretability problem, while it's not solved, severely mitigates a lot of the hallucination, confabulation problems that were present in the
Then
early
is it
release.
no regrets for policy directionally to say, you need to show your work. You need to incorporate a real evidence review.
With citations, with logic, and I think
and
we're.
that also help with the proprietary issues
It
you're talking
does.
about?
It does. And I think in healthcare, this was going to go nowhere without explainability. That mechanistic interpretability problem was a non-starter. Now, I think with the O1 release, I think the direction of travel is very clear. I personally believe this is a solvable issue, and the time frame for solving it is faster than I think most people expect.
And let's take a flip side of this. So we've talked about the AI tools themselves. The healthcare organization. So earlier we talked about a lot of them are, they're struggling today. I mean,
Yes.
it's high and rising costs, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the efforts that frankly have had, we're, you guys probably noticed we're like 8 days before a pretty contentious election. One thing that both the previous Trump administration and the Biden administration have kind of agreed on in this space of how do we get to better healthcare is we need to stop paying just for more services. We need to pay for what works, get towards paying for health, and that has a lot of challenges in it. We need more interoperable data that supports coordinated care without necessarily having fully consolidated care. We need more transparency about quality and about prices. But I got to say, it's been slow going. It's been hard for healthcare organizations to adapt. We're in North Carolina, one of the leaders in working across bipartisan basis to make healthcare more person-centered. We've got kind of agreement across different parts of the healthcare system. We're prioritizing some early sort of basic primary care quality measures, but it's been a lot of work and slow. Is this an area too where policy should say, look, the expectations are going up, if not about actually reducing costs, improving outcomes, but at least being clear about it? Amy's looking at you, but I go with either of you. I want to.
So I think that we're in a place where, again, it's not only show your work and transparency, it's going to be also demonstrate the output and the effect, right? And that's going to be a requirement over and over again. I'll just say one thing about transparency, which is that even if something is not transparent, but it is clearly very effective, we will accept it. We've got many examples of that. Many of our medications, we don't understand truly their biologic mechanism of action, but we do understand their impact on health. And therefore, we have approved those medications and pay for them in our health systems. And so I think transparency takes us a long way, but isn't always a requirement, and demonstration of effect is something that we have as an expectation. And when we think about the overall cost in the health system, actually demonstration of impact on cost and quality, I think is where everybody wants to go. It does strike me that, again, you sort of need essentially the data layer to make all of this work, whether that is demonstration of effect, or also the data layer essentially is the railroads to which algorithms that personalized care get delivered, right? So practically speaking, any policy endeavors that make sure our data railroads work for us, and I can come back to that, I think is going to be very important.
Maybe you can say, let me see if Eric, you want to get in on the expectations about what healthcare systems should deliver at a time when they're complaining that it's really hard to do what they're being asked to do even now.
I'm in total agreement with Amy. I do believe, though, that the application layer right now of Gen AI is so embryonic, right? Having a heavy hand in regulation, I think, is premature. Now, that's a broad statement. Let's also remember there are geopolitical implications here. This is becoming the great game competition between US and China. And I always think about it as all this innovation. So America innovates, Europe regulates, China appropriates, just to be a little provocative. And I do think that you are seeing in Europe right now, some are lauding as very progressive in regulation, others are sort of lamenting. But I think progress in AI from a technical perspective is suffocated in Europe right now. I think most of the innovation here is happening in Silicon Valley. And I think we are so nascent in terms of the application layer in healthcare. If you think about $1 trillion in CapEx that's going to be deployed in GPUs, data centers, nuclear power, et cetera, over the next 3 years, you're going to have this asymmetry between input and output. The input right now is the biggest industrial mobilization since World War II. The hyperscalers alone are spending $250 billion this year. The output is going to be super anemic. In healthcare, the application layer right now is documentation, summarization, listening. I know on the synthetic and computational biology front, I'm super excited about what Isomorphic Labs is doing, evolutionary scale, in vitro, recursion. These are amazing companies, and I think that is going to we're going to see an advent of this sort of new molecules that are created. But
Going into clinical trials, being likely to succeed, but so far still really sensitive.
So I have cognitive dissonance here because I have great optimism of where this is going to end up. You're seeing a lot of investment right now, but the output in healthcare right now, we are in the first pitch of the first inning in terms of how this is going to play out. I actually don't, and I'm being a little bit irreverent, I don't know what to regulate yet, what dimensions we're going to regulate. I love the mobilization for independent organizations that are making suggestions around this, but this is evolving so quickly. I'm a little loath to be overly prescriptive right now on the regulatory front. And that's my own bias. And part of that bias comes from capital allocation. I work with TowerBrook. We invest in companies. I don't know what the regulation guardrail should be at this moment.
And Amy, can go back to like any no regret steps at this point? I mean, it seems like you're about to get to at least some steps to encourage getting, helping that application layer demonstrate more easily and quickly whether some of these applications are actually helping.
So the first thing is my bias at the moment still is to say we don't know exactly what it should look like with respect to the regulatory framework of tomorrow. So there's a lot of work to get there, and therefore creating an edict of this is what it should look like does feel dangerous to me. But we do have some things that we can be working on right now. The first is that there are a series of very clear demand signals that we can start putting into place through CMMI and other mechanisms that do certain things. One is test AI within the context of day-to-day healthcare delivery and whether or not it makes healthcare more efficient, patient-centric, equitable access. We can actually ask those, and we can set up demonstration projects to do that work. We can make sure that the results are transparent in terms of the output. So that's sort of one set of activities that seems very clear. The second is that we can create demand signals around what I call the data architecture of the future. We actually have to make sure that, again, data is mobile and available to us within the context of our algorithm, that we have not pre-specified data standards, but rather pre-specified mechanisms through which data flows. We've been working at the National Academy of Medicine around talking about the need for national thinking on data architecture. I think that one of the places that there's divergence in opinions is how to make sure that there's oversight of national data architecture, but we can actually set in place demand signals. One very practical one that's happening right now is a CMS quality measure requiring the documentation of radiation exposure with every image. Well, that documentation requirement is forcing health systems to move images around in order to calculate radiation exposure. And just that image movement is starting to unlock a lot of our currently locked up medical data. So creating those demand signals through a series of mechanisms like quality measures, like CMMI projects, like
More outcome oriented.
very outcome oriented, but also with the point of view of data movement and data exchange as being a requirement to accomplish whatever that task is. And that's one of the reasons that CMS measure is important and interesting. The third is we have a lot of work to do in a very public way around conversations around data privacy, consent, data stewardship. And in fact, HIPAA may not work for us as well as we want it to as we go forward. I'm not necessarily saying we have to go back and revisit HIPAA, but I am saying that we haven't had the public discussion around consent that's going to be needed for the future. Your data actually walks with you through your life. Data stewardship is a lifelong activity. HIPAA and consent is a cross-sectional activity that doesn't have the opportunity to get updated across change, time as your thinking changes, as the overall policy context changes, et cetera, and there's going to need to be some updates there as well.
Is there something goal oriented we could do there too? Again, not putting in too many sort of micro regulations, but this point about trust in data that are being used. I think we had a conversation earlier that at least some people find talking to chatbots a lot easier than talking to a human about things that are sensitive. But that's not going to stay that way if they don't continue to have confidence that their data isn't going to be misused and their privacy is going to be protected.
Yeah, I think what Mark, you're highlighting, what Amy's highlighting is completely right. I do think this data sovereignty question to the individual and to the organization, right? Part of the opacity problem is, we have to have conviction that our data at an organizational level, at an individual level, that is not going to, as these models ingest all of these data. From a competitive point of view, organization to organization, I would be concerned that my data were uploaded to this model, the model gets more intelligent, and then a competitor avails themselves of that data. So I think there's organization implications. I think there are individual implications. The data question has been a theme throughout our discussion, and I'm so fascinated by this because it's also, we've come back to, I should say, and thank you all who've been sending in questions via the Slido. A lot of those relate to, what are the best examples of how data has been used to help validate AI? What are you thinking about, like the best ways to train and update programs, things that you all have been touching on. So we've been trying to build those in, but it is a question that people here keep. Yeah, and I'm going to step aside from the individual implications because I think that's huge, and your description of stewardship really resonates with me. But I will talk about the organization implications. I think about data sovereignty and data exfiltration, right? So if my data as an organization accrues asymmetric value to me competitively, I want to be very guarded about where that data goes. The reality is that most of the proprietary data has not touched the frontier models. The frontier models have ingested all of Common Crawl. Common Crawl is scraping the internet. It's 100 trillion tokens. And when you dedupe it and you get rid of the garbage in there, it's probably 30 trillion high quality tokens. Llama 3, just as an example, was trained on 15 trillion tokens. We are going to hit a data ceiling if we haven't already. So to me, the great unlock in this next competitive chapter and evolution of AI is in these proprietary healthcare data, both from an administrative simplification point of view, from a care augmentation point of view, from a synthetic and computational biology point of view. And the one that you just touched on, Mark, which I hope we can talk about, is this, I think about it as intelligent social agents, right? So the chatbots that are getting multimodal. The advanced conversation mode for OpenAI is so compelling. I don't know if you've played with this, but it's 230 millisecond pauses. With multimodality and computer vision, it can actually discern micro expressions. These things are evincing theory of mind, where you can actually discern the unvoiced human emotion. And then there's the powerful human behavioral impulse to tell the truth to an avatar instead of a human because of stigmatization, discrimination, judgment. 1 out of every 3 people in industrialized countries is lonely. We know that when you have a medical complaint with a behavioral comorbidity, your medical costs are between 2.5 and 6.7x more expensive. We know that patient abandonment of pharmaceuticals is a $400 billion annual issue for the United States. So if you think about the propensity of a human to tell the truth to a chatbot and to actually remedy loneliness in some cases, I think about the healthcare implications of that. And yes, there are data sovereignty, data stewardship questions there, but counterbalancing against that is this opening frontier of potentially using AI as a mitigator of loneliness. There's a lot of studies that are emerging that suggest that engaging with the AI is so there's the stimulation hypothesis. It's going to stimulate me to interact with other humans, give me social skills, et cetera, or the displacement hypothesis. I'm just going to sit in a room talking to my chatbot. Early studies suggest it is more of a stimulation than a displacement. So I'm deeply curious about this as we go forward.
I do want to get, and maybe Amy, I'm going to give you the last word here. It's been a great discussion. Just want to get to one more concept that's come up in several questions that we've touched on, and that's access to this and differential access and disparities and concerns about health equity. So what you described, very positive potential vision for the future. You can easily see how that might work out better depending on data and tools and so forth for certain populations than others. I'm not sure if this is what you're going to talk about, but you could I do think we need to flag that as a topic that people here would like to hear more about, maybe for the next panel.
So I'll hit on two things. I was listening to what Eric was saying. I was thinking about experiments that we were running here at Duke Health System 15 years ago, where what we showed was that people were in the cancer clinics were much more willing to talk about psychological concerns and sexual health to computers than they were to people, and that we were actually able to not only identify key challenges, but then also try and start figuring out what was the healthcare delivery system going to look like to accommodate what patients wanted to talk about and their concerns. It meant, though, all of a sudden, we discovered we needed sexual health professionals to be able to talk to patients about something that we really weren't aware of. And we also discovered that we needed to have way more psychological and social work visits than we actually already had on the books. So my point is that we absolutely need to figure out how to do this work. And I am a big believer. We need to figure out how do we safely pull these data sets together, such as psychological data together with all of the different elements of health to be able to build our algorithms and run our algorithms. We actually also have to make sure that the healthcare delivery system is ready on the other side for what this now unlocks of what our needs are. And I think that's the set of experiments we need to work our way through a set of pilots, demonstrations, getting it figured out, but acknowledge that if we do it all at once too quickly, things topple over.
Maybe some expectations about actually reducing some of these access disparities that have been built into the existing system.
Exactly. And that was going to be my last thing that I was going to say, which practically speaking, we have to do it in a way that recognizes inclusivity for all, and that also meets different people where they are. So that essentially not all of us want to talk to a chatbot, but some of us really do. But also our data sets need to represent all of us and acknowledge the fact that there are different implications of biased data sets that can really take things in the wrong direction.
All right, early days, tremendous amount of potential, but some good themes to take forward into our policy discussions and our further work here. Thank you both for joining us. Our next session, please join me in welcoming Dean Mary Klopman. As I mentioned earlier, Mary is Executive Vice President for Health Affairs at Duke, Dean of the Duke University School of Medicine, and Chief Academic Officer for Duke Health. Mary, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your strategic prioritization around advancing health AI, both in terms of the technical and clinical leadership and collaborations with us at Margolis on these important policies. It's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks for throwing me in the fire here. I am speaking from a very different viewpoint of how we think about AI, less from being the expert, more from being kind of a responsible administrator to figure out pace of change and how we harness that change in a responsible way. Thrilled to be here, the Margolis. I can tell Mark, I remember when the Margolis Center was just an idea that Bob Margolis, Bob is here, great, had, and he was very fortunate to recruit Mark into that idea, which is now a fully mature institute at Duke, which is really exciting. So it's always great to see you, Bob. And I'm so glad to see Amy. I'm sure Mark did the full introductions, but she is a Duke alum and hopefully a proud Duke alum and the most recent member of our board of trustees. So I'm thrilled about that. So as I think about AI, it's overwhelming, obviously, because it has the potential to have tremendous impact on virtually everything that we do in an academic health system. Certainly our missions, when you think about our education mission, our clinical mission, which is largely the focus today, our research mission, and our community partnership, it has tremendous potential, but significant risk as well, particularly when we think about community partnerships and how we work effectively with our community. When I look at our education mission, by the way, if I seem a little stressed out, I'm in the middle of what's called the LCME accreditation process today and tomorrow, which determines whether we're a medical school for the next 7 years. I think we are. But when we think about education, I mean, we are seeing students coming in with much more knowledge of tools that are available, particularly in the AI space, than most of our instructors. I'm sure that my instructors wouldn't like me saying that, but that is indeed the case. And the challenge for us is working with our students in how to be responsible users of this tool, stressing that it is a tool. It is not the end of our education, but it's a tool to facilitate things like clinical decision making. And our responsibility as educators is really to work with our students on how to use that tool, not to replace, but to augment what we are as physicians, taking care of individuals, hopefully aspirational goals that allows us more time to really think about the humanistic development of our providers. So education, a huge challenge in how we look to AI to both enhance the education potential, but not get in the way of training physicians in a way that they understand the fundamentals of the patient-provider relationship. As we look at our research mission, I mean, again, extraordinary. I am thrilled that as part of our Duke Science and Technology Initiative, which started out as kind of an initiative to find the very best what we call wet lab scientists, best athletes, has evolved into finding just a whole community of scientists that are both dry lab, data scientists, embedded with our wet lab scientists in a community of scientists that are really going to see the benefits of a tool like AI in rapidly accelerating the speed of discovery science. It's remarkable when you're thinking of protein modeling, what can be done today in developing new targets and new therapeutics. So that's all very exciting. So when I look at clinical care, a little bit less, I would say, thrilled about just going out there as the Wild West and seeing how these great algorithms work in clinical care. More really thinking about the responsibility of how we use these tools, both in terms of safety and the concept of trustworthy AI, but how do we also communicate to both our providers and our community how we use these tools and how we're building that trust relationship as these become more and more part of how we care for patients. So I'm really excited that our leadership in data science, particularly under the leadership of Michael Pensina, has taken this on as both a local thought leader as well as a national thought leader on how do we build a framework that starts to think about the safe and ethical application of AI tools, particularly in the clinical arena, where we know there are just so many tools now becoming available, and really raising some very fundamental questions about who should know what, when. What are we using it? How are we using it? How do our providers understand how to use algorithms? And how do our patients understand how we're using algorithms to actually make decisions in patient care? So fortunately, as I said, I do have leaders that have been very thoughtful in leading a national coalition in health AI that is really important as we start developing a framework around what should oversight look like. Granted, we don't know what it's going to look like even, a half a year from now, but really putting together thought leaders that start actually thinking about what is a national framework? How should we look at how we keep a directory of the algorithms that we're using in the clinical space, how we assess them both before we apply them, but on a regular basis as we're using them in the clinic, as our patient populations change over time. How do we build a framework that we can assure both our providers and our patients that we are, number one, focused on their safety and the ability to really use these tools responsibly? We know that bias is a huge issue in medicine. The worst thing that can happen is we enhance the bias in our decision-making for how we take care of patients. So there's a significant responsibility there. And as we get really, really excited about the potential, we've also seen some missteps early on. I won't repeat some of them because some of them are still under investigation, but it really stresses the importance of understanding these tools and understanding the framework of assessing the safety of these tools as we roll them out in our clinical mission. Ultimately, tremendous potential. I don't want to underestimate the potential to decrease the burden that's both on our patients and providers today as they both try to navigate a very complex world of medical care. These tools have tremendous potential, but we really have to make sure they deliver on that, as opposed to adding another layer of burden on either the provider or the patient. So I'm really excited about the work that we're doing here, really focus on this concept of both innovation and trustworthy AI. They're not mutually exclusive. I hope everybody really believes that they should go hand in hand, but really being a thought leader in how we develop that framework, both within our own institution, where we are going to be responsible for the tools that we use on our patients, but nationally, how we develop a framework. And then, there's two very different schools of thought here. One is, every system on their own, try to figure it out, versus the way that we approach devices and drugs currently, which is a national framework that everybody has a similar understanding of what safety and application looks like in this space. So I'm very appreciative of the work that Michael Pensina is leading here and really excited about Duke being a leader. With that, I'd like to reiterate my excitement about the new institute, the Health Policy Institute. So appreciative, Bob, of all the work that you and Mark have done to get this off the ground, and so much fun to see where we are today. So with that, thanks for inviting me. Be glad to participate in any conversation.
Thank you so much, Dean Cloud. The Dean actually stole a little bit of my thunder. As we're setting up for the next panel, I did actually want to, we have a spotlight video on some of that really innovative governance that is happening at Duke for Duke Health about the clinical tools.
My name is Nicolette Economou, and I serve as the founding director of algorithm-based clinical decision support oversight here at Duke. This initiative, also known as ABCDIS Oversight, focuses on the governance, evaluation, and monitoring of all algorithms and algorithmic technologies intended to be used for patient care at Duke Health. In other words, it is my and our capable team's collective responsibility to ensure that all AI and algorithmic software used at Duke's health system are carefully reviewed throughout stages of their lifecycle, from initial development through deployment and use in the patient care setting. I'm also the director of the Duke Health AI Evaluation and Governance Program, which is at the forefront of operationalizing trustworthy and responsible AI in healthcare. Our focus is on building robust governance and evaluation frameworks for AI, which are of utmost importance to ensure AI technologies being introduced into the clinical setting are not only safe, fair, and effective, but also integrated into clinical practice in ways that enhance trust and accountability. At Duke Health AI Evaluation and Governance, our aim goes beyond local governance. We're thinking about AI at scale, creating recommendations, incentives, and tools that can democratize trustworthy AI for all healthcare systems nationwide. By setting national guidelines and establishing best practices, we're working to ensure that AI in healthcare is ethical, high quality, and accessible to everyone, not just at Duke, but across the country. We're also interested in building transparency between organizations on the benefit and risks AI may bring. Our work centers on establishing the processes and infrastructure necessary to govern AI responsibly. We develop new methodologies to streamline evaluation processes, making it easier to assess AI models and deploy them efficiently across diverse populations. This includes leveraging AI itself to scale model deployment, ensuring that solutions can reach patients across different healthcare settings. Another critical area of our focus is building comprehensive safety and reporting frameworks for AI technologies in healthcare. These frameworks help us continuously monitor AI models, ensuring they perform safely and effectively while maintaining fairness and transparency. We're proud to be part of Duke's ethos that values discovery and excellence in its culture and its mission of advancing health together.
So welcome, everyone. I'm Christina Silcox. I'm the Research Director of Digital Health here at Duke Margolis. And I'm so excited about this policy panel today. I do want to take a quick moment before we get started, just to help people understand where the policy space is right now. Mark and Amy and Eric had a great conversation about how do we balance innovation with safety and encouraging that evidence development around clinical impact of these tools. And we often hear in this space, and it actually came up a little bit in the last talk, about this being sort of a wild, wild west. But I do want to push back on that a little bit and say that there has been work building guardrails in this space. And there are multiple federal agencies, some of which are represented here, that already have statutory authority over AI tools. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. When we think about who has authority over AI tools, probably the first person that comes to mind is FDA. And FDA does regulate medical devices. Those are tools that diagnose, cure, mitigate, or prevent a disease. And they've already authorized over 1,000 AI-enabled devices. And as part of that authorization process, they can require clear evidence of benefit and also transparency through labeling. But many of the AI tools that people are most excited about do not fit under that medical device definition. So who does have authority in those non-device spaces? So one group is the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, which has a much longer name now that Steve's going to go over, but I'm going to just say ONC right now. And they set requirements for electronic health records, or EHRs, that are used in health systems to be certified. And so last December, they finalized a rule that required transparency on machine learning tools that support decision-making. And that included information about how those tools were trained and tested and how they should be used. However, these regulations are only applicable to tools that are associated in some way with the EHR developer. And while transparency is required, there are no standardized reporting methods required or a requirement around third-party review. And then the Office of Civil Rights has also finalized a rule this summer to require that health systems make reasonable efforts to identify and mitigate bias in patient decision support tools. And this is actually a very broad rule that applies to a lot of different types of tools, not just AI. But OCR's authority is really over the deployers of these technologies, what we call covered entities, and not necessarily the developers. And when we talk about those deployers, we do worry, as was talked about in the last session, that maybe not all health systems have the means to do some of the testing, that Amy talked about Yale doing, for example. And so how do we handle that? So we can see here that a lot of these authorities and rules overlap, but there are, and I also should state, these circles are not to scale. They're just into scale as to which, what fit the writing. But I did try to give you an idea of where some of these overlaps are in these different terms and the different spaces that people have, that different agencies have authority. But it's also clear that there are gaps, where there's less clear who might have statutory authority. And this is particularly true for operational and administrative tools, a lot of which will be the ones that were talked about in the last session. Agencies also have limits on the requirements, the types of requirements they can put into place. And they do not necessarily have authority over all the relevant stakeholders. They may only have authority over one. And so when we think about this in the policy sense, payment can often fill some of those spaces. For example, ONC's authority around EHR certification really comes into play because Medicare requires that health providers use certified EHRs. Medicare can also require safety and quality measures if they want, if health systems want to participate in the Medicare program, which everyone does. But again, this affects the deployers of the technology and less of the developers. On the developer side, though, we do have insurance companies who can and do require that tools have evidence of clinical impact before they will pay for the use of this tool. And that does have significant influence. But again, many AI tools are not directly reimbursed by insurance companies. They're sort of within the process of healthcare. And that really makes that influence be diluted. So, complicated space, Lots of different things to talk about, but having given you that little 101 policy in this space, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start just going outward. First, we have Steve Posnack, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy. We have Troy Tasbez, who is the Director of the Digital Health Center of Excellence at the FDA. And we have Melanie Fontes Rayner, the Director of the Office of Civil Rights at HHS. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with just a big open question about, what is the most important action that each one of you and your agencies are taking right now? Kind of thinking about how do you balance that potential of AI, but the importance of making sure that you're addressing some of those major safety risks, making sure that the AI is available to a broad array of the population. Can I start with Troy?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me, but I'm not sure how do we follow the last panel with this riveting topic of policy and regulation. I mean,
more data.
right? I think we need more data and exactly. I think you said a couple of things that I want to address here. So we all have statutory authorities, but the question is not whether we have those. The question is, can we apply it to this new paradigm of type of product that is coming to the market? And what I mean by that, FDA statutory authorities have been around since 1976. That is effectively the regulation that we use to regulate AI-enabled medical devices. Now, when it was written for a very, very specific type of medical device, which were really static devices and hardware-based devices. And so now all of a sudden you have to apply something that was written for a very, very specific type of device to a device that is adapting, consistently learning, changing, depending on where you actually deploy it. And all of a sudden, you're also dealing with things like where you train the model and where you deploy the model may be very, very different population sets. So all of a sudden, what FDA cared about in the prior world, which was the pre-market authorization of evaluating a device, making sure that it's safe and effective, may or may not really be applicable to this new world of deploying and proliferating these models into multiple different environments that may have different performance characteristics in that environment. So the statutory authorities that we do have does not really apply to generative AI. And that's effectively the first problem that we're running into now. Changing statutory authorities are very difficult, obviously. And that's why I made the point around the current ones have been around for 50 years. And so we are working with Congress to see what is needed in order to make sure that this post-market part of the equation is actually a little more important. And how do we actually enable that? It's an operational issue because the process works is that someone comes into FDA with a product with a market authorization requirement. We go through the evaluation, we validate the product itself, and it gets deployed. And the post-market part of that equation usually only happens when there's an adverse event. So it's a very transactional issue. And we try to resolve the problem itself or we pull the product off market. It changes when you're now dealing with a product that has been deployed into 20, 30 different locations with vastly different data sets that it's going to learn from or relearn from. And now all of a sudden you have to say, well, what performance benchmark am I using to validate and continuously validate this? And what happens if one or two of the locations are now performing unintended? It has unintended consequences. Do you pull the entire product off the market or do you just try to resolve the two locations? And these are all the struggles that we're having. Or they're not struggles, but we're trying to answer in what is the best possible approach towards solving these problems, right? So you can think about regulation in one aspect of it, or you can think about also best practices, which is something that we're also trying to do. And I always kind of look at the world and what is in my control versus what do I have dependency on. And so what we do have in our control is working with the industry around establishing these best practices. So we've been focused on life cycle management practices in making sure that from a standards development, everyone is operating with a consistent kind of standard. And it is inconsistent right now. When I joined FDA 2 years ago, we did a landscape analysis. There were 220 different standard documents floating out there, which means that we had no standards whatsoever. So we actually went through all of that and found consistencies across the board and said, this is the starting position, but we need the industry to own this. And so our focus has been around the lifecycle management, the best practices, monitoring, which is a very important part of the component of the lifecycle management. And on top of that, we are also issuing guidances with the current statutory authorities that we do have. And what guidance is, this is a policy one-on-one thing that I actually learned when I went into the government itself, but their interpretation of a law, which with the Chevron deference, that also challenges the way that we're having to write guidances that have to be very, very specific. And so,
You're not a lawyer. I would say that in this room.
well, when I joined, well, I am. No, I'm not. But I did say I was a liability at best to the government when I joined. So there you go. Welcome to this panel. And so we're having to effectively balance all of these issues. And then on top of that, we have to work with Congress to say, well, what are the action language that we have to put into a law? And I think that the last panel really touched on this one. This is the early stages of this. And the analogy that I used earlier with Nicoletta was like, it's like electricity. You discovered electricity. Now let's go regulate anything and everything that electricity uses. And it just doesn't work that way, right? So we have to be very thoughtful around how we're thinking about this concept of developing guardrails for this very, very specific product, this capability.
All right, I'm impressed with Troy's compression algorithm. I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to pack that much in. So anytime we get into these policy conversations, we always get a little bit Susie and that we talk about the who's and the hows and the what's and the whys. So our little space is around health IT. And as was mentioned, we issued a regulation as a first step toward transparency. And one of our theories is that with greater consistency and predictability, that can help the market move forward. And so our first step, at least from a regulatory perspective, was to introduce more transparency. And so by the end of this year, developers that go through our certification program need to be transparent. No judgment on the algorithms that are included, but need to be transparent about, the nutrition facts that are built into those algorithms to allow, clinical users out there to have more information until there's greater explainability, as was talked about in the prior panel, around how those algorithms are designed, everything that kind of is under the hood, for their awareness. So that's one of the big priorities that we've been working on as well. And then as was mentioned, we did get a bit of a bureaucratic blow up. And the secretary decided with the deputy secretary to shift our office's responsibilities to also include those of the HHS chief technology officer, chief artificial intelligence officer, and chief data officer. So for the first time in the department's history of all three of those chiefs, trifecta all together under one roof. And we have our own internal aspects of understanding how AI is being run across the department as well. And so we have both now an internal and external related focus for our work.
Thinking about how to govern both the clinical tools and also the internal tools.
Yes.
Can I say one thing? I think because I heard this in the other panel, transparency and explainability are two separate issues. And sometimes we conflate those. And explainability is really the what Eric was talking about, which is really the reasoning behind the algorithm itself. And transparency is effectively more of the documentation of how did you train the model? What data did you use? How are you deploying the model? Is it using a separate vehicle to bring the capability itself? How are you monitoring the model? How are you doing revision control? So those are very two separate concepts, and it's important from a standards perspective to speak and align on those issues to ensure that the entire industry is also thinking about this. Because you're like Eric was right, you can't explain these models. Most of the developers in these companies are having a hard time explaining how the model is performing. But what we can do is agree on transparency requirements around. So when a user, whether it's a medical professional or a patient, is actually asking about the model itself, that it's a clear language that they can explain how the model was trained and tested and it's performing against the intended population.
And one of the transparency principles that we saw, data elements that, in the ONC rule and also in the transparency principles that FDA just released, was really this emphasis on understanding how well is this going to work for diverse populations, those subpopulations within the indicated population, which I think that's something that OCR has been thinking about really deeply as well.
Yeah, so I run the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That's the first time our circle has been bigger than the FDA's ever. ONCs. We're really, really small. You were making me think of all kinds of data sets. I regulate a very wealthy industry. So for example, I'm in charge of the Change cyber attack at HHS because I regulate HIPAA. The Change CEO, United CEO, his salary plus bonuses plus his 5 top executives is probably in the ballpark of my budget. You laugh, but it's true. So we are in charge of civil rights and privacy. So I would say, one, we do have a new regulation on non-discrimination in health programs and activities. It is the wild, wild west, but it's also not. The law hasn't changed, right? And the same way providers are on the hook when they use a new tool treating a patient, this is just another tool that we're using in that same context and we're regulating it as such. However, I will say we did try to draft a rule that was, we have a lot of experience in HIPAA, where we have a rule that is, we have multiple rules that are over decades old, where they are technology neutral, they are scalable, and they are flexible, adaptable. And we did try to draft something that was much in the same in the civil rights context, because we don't want to stifle the use of artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, algorithms, whatever, in the context of healthcare. We know it has propense capability and ways in which we can help our healthcare sector overall, including health disparities, right? But we also need to make sure that we're continuing to have the same safeguards and being clear about what is expected. So our rule tries to simplify that and the identification and mitigation of that risk. We've actually worked with Dr. Pincini and others here at Duke, thinking about what other tools can we put out as we think about this. What else does the healthcare space need to be on notice for these things? Our rule takes effect next summer. We also developed a new rule on disability. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, those regulations have not been updated in over 50 years. So we updated them this year. And as part of that, that rule has a provision on discriminatory use of value assessment tools. And again, it's something we know in healthcare, we see them used, we've seen discriminatory use of them in contexts, whether it's a state agency or otherwise. And we know now we can set barriers or parameters in place to have a safe use. So all of these things are meant to flow within the healthcare context. I like to remind folks, because when we were thinking about 1557 in particular, which is in the Affordable Care Act, when we were thinking about this, we got so many comments that were on very opposite ends of the continuum. Just bar all use of AI. Don't allow any use of AI that has any input variables that have any of the protected classes, whether it's race, disability, sex, national origin, you name it. And then we got on the other context, don't regulate us at all. We don't need regulation. And so we tried to land somewhere in the middle where we continue to allow for the adaptable use of this technology while also recognizing, as was stated here multiple times, this is going to happen on a case-by-case basis. We receive complaints. A complaint comes in and then we handle it. It's a fact-specific inquiry relative to that particular provider or system or insurance company. It's never going to be a one-size-fits-all. But as we have more enforcement space in this area, I think we'll be able to learn from that, as will the healthcare sector.
So I think this is a great segue actually to my next question, because some of the things I just heard are, we do have tools that do still work, but we also are running into spaces where they're not working as well. And one of the challenges is it's just such a broad space that I love that electricity analogy. And Amy touched a little bit on this as well, where there's just so many tools and it doesn't necessarily make sense to think about them all in the same way. And oftentimes when we think about this in the policy space, when we have such a big broad space, we do think about things, we do think about things in a risk-based approach. So I was wondering if whether y'all think this is a useful approach here, and if so, are there specific attributes that might help you think through some of those risks? You mentioned some of the data elements that might be more. And then how do you also balance risk when there is significant benefit? That was one of the questions that the audience came up with in the last panel. How do you make sure that we are allowing some of these innovations that could have such a dramatic impact, even if there are risks? How do we make that work? I'm actually going to start with Melanie this time.
Yeah, so I will say one of the other things we didn't even talk about is privacy, which came up at the tail end of the last panel. So I was recently at a CHAI event. I was talking to a bunch of doctors about AI. And in that context, the conversation stemmed around some systems had very specific protocol in place. They were testing things, they were using it, they were encouraging it, and that others were not. But in those systems that were not, they still had residents using algorithms and AI on their personal devices with patient information. And as a civil rights director, that's like my worst, I mean, that should be everyone in this room's worst nightmare, right? Because it's not being like noticed at all in the hospital system. No one's keeping track of it. And now we just exposed with individuals protected health information to possible impermissible use and disclosure and possible breach. And so I think that that's the worst case scenario to me, other than just not using it at all. We've been thinking a lot across the department. I mean, a lot of this is very intentional. We've been on a lot of panels together. My rule on non-discrimination uses very similar terminology to the ONC rule. That wasn't an accident. That's because we want to make sure we're consistent across the department, and we're trying to be as streamlined in its use across the department to the industry, right? We don't want to create more barriers because you're right. We all have these different regulatory authorities. We have guidances throughout the entirety of our building, and a lot of it was synced up and some of it wasn't. And so now we have this opportunity at the front end of this to really be streamlined in how we think about this. And I think as part of that, we have the steering committee at HHS. I actually lead the ethical, what's it called? Ethical use and harm committee. And so as part of that work, we've been thinking a lot about how do we fold into the work that others are thinking about our insurance labs? How do we think about things like testing? How do we provide equity across our healthcare system, right? We haven't even really tapped into that, right? You have all kinds of providers that are covered under federal law that are, whether it's civil rights or HIPAA or whatnot, and those providers are applicable in the same context. There's not exceptions for them. And so a place like Duke is going to have more infrastructure and resources to do this work versus a small federally qualified health center or a rural clinic somewhere. And how do we replicate that at HHS so we're providing equitable scale for use of it across the country?
So Troy, I think I'm going to ask you sort of some of the same question, because obviously FDA has been thinking about risk-based approaches since its inception with device regulation. But are there things about AI specifically where some of the kind of the traditional thoughts around risk don't fit quite as well?
Well, I mean, risk categorization is changing, right? The minute that you're applying AI to different parts of kind of the healthcare, let's call it delivery value chain. And so you might think that prior auth, right, is an administrative process that you say, well, is that a low risk thing? Well, what if a denial happens because of an incorrect algorithm, which there are some fairly well-known cases that has happened. Now someone's not actually getting treatment. You can say that that's a very risky issue, right? So now all of a sudden we have to think of risk very differently. So maybe you categorize it as medically purpose-driven algorithms versus administrative purpose-driven algorithms, and then you find categorization. So to Melanie's point, I've also been in rooms where I would be sitting in the middle of two healthcare systems, and one would say, we're making huge investments into it, and we are building our governance framework. We are all in, and then next person was like, yeah, we're not doing it anytime soon. And they're fairly equal sized healthcare systems, right? So when I think of risk, I think the risk categories maybe should be very consistent, but someone's willing and ability to play in those risks should be varied, right? And that could be based on, do they have the necessary infrastructure? Now, where it gets really complicated is that you're right. Like we're sitting here in Duke University, and a lot of these academic medical centers have tremendous amount of resources to be able to implement these in their environment. And part of the actually expense is not the algorithm itself, it's the integration cost of the algorithm. And that requires not just the resources from a capital perspective, but it also requires a whole lot of resource from administration, operational perspective. And so what it could end up doing is kind of driving this digital divide that we already have, because smaller healthcare systems are not going to have that type of resources to be able to incorporate these technologies, which is where they actually need it probably the most. And I want to touch on a statistics that I've been recently giving, because this actually is not about AI, but the problem statement is slightly differently. And Eric also said this, it was about 22, well, I'm going to first give you the demand side of the problem. So the demand side of the problem is that every year from here on out until 2030, we have 4 million people that are projected to retire or become retirement eligible. This is baby boomer generation, which by 2030, every single baby boomer will either be retired or be eligible, which means that they're Medicare eligible. That's your demand side. On the supply side, 22 million healthcare workers in the United States, 6.5 million of them are going to retire by 2030. And as much as that we have a lot of openings, the replacement rate is going to be around 2 million. That's your supply side. And so when you have a supply demand imbalance, what happens? Inflation. So the inflation could be added, or it could be considered from a cost per capita perspective, which we're already the highest by nation in economic developed nations. Or you could also apply that to the timeline to get care, time it takes to get care. So when I think of AI, I actually don't think of it in terms of, we focus on the capabilities, but the problem statement is not necessarily AI versus not AI. The problem statement is how do we actually balance this imbalance that we have? And what tools can you use to do that, right? So from a risk perspective, I am looking at it not necessarily from a risk categorization, pure like the capability perspective, but the risk around, are we able to deliver care or not? And so where should we apply artificial intelligence where we're not going to be able to deliver the care? And then what infrastructure do you have that you've accompanied with that to ensure that the safety and effectiveness of these tools are also preserved?
Yeah, the population risk involved in not having access to care. Where AI might be able to help. So I think that's really fascinating. And I think that the other point you brought up is really important to understand. When we think about traditional medical devices, an EKG machine works just as well at one health system as another. But the fact that you have that overlay of it may not work, one AI system may not work as well everywhere. But thinking about how do you monitor that, right? Traditionally medical device spaces, high risk devices only really would have to do post-implementation studies, but they would do them in a couple of sites. They wouldn't do it everywhere for the most part.
But also thinking about the diversity of the populations that are served across the country, right? Work like language access. You're talking about senior citizens who maybe also have high propensity to have disability, right? Like thinking about those compounding layers as like multidimensional consumers, which we also need to have diversity of reflection in the model itself.
And ONC split up the risk a little bit. I know that you have two different kind of spaces for that predictive decision support, where one predictive and one evidence-based, and you think about them a little bit differently. And you also had risk mitigation as one of your data elements. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how y'all are thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one space where we, in our little regulatory layer, that we took an approach in terms of dividing between, say, more the deterministic versus the predictive side of things, and then equally recognize that there were intervention risk management techniques that could be applied to the health IT as well. I think we'd emphasize again, even though, I don't know, whatever scale we were joking around about the size of our oval there, we still don't have a lot of that space in the health IT usage space that is actually regulated. And so if Duke were to develop its own, that's not subject to our regulatory authority. And so there's a wide area of a gray zone or gradient where we're trying to set best practices. We're trying to use our regulatory requirements for health IT developers that go through our certification program as a way to show a pathway and an opportunity for collaboration, because Chai and others are starting to use some of the stuff that we've included. I'd also want to just echo what Melanie mentioned. We all work together and we emphasize that on all the panels because I know we get a question about that. But the other thing to recognize too, looking across our national coordinator role that we still retain, is each agency, until the day where Congress decides that we're going to have an administration on AI or something, we each have our own layer that we operate in. And a lot of times we have to stitch all those layers together to look at the cumulative footprint that HHS has to make progress. And so if it's around civil rights and disparities and equity and devices and the EHRs that are using the health system, all of that is the collective touch that our department provides. And so we do a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that all those pieces are kind of fitting together. And I think from the pandemic to now, AI is just another, serving as the impetus for us to work together on a variety of these issues.
Absolutely. And I think that, when you do have that harmonized aspect, you also have to set a standard. That I think that even when spaces where, exactly what you said, and even spaces where that authority might not be there, there starts to be an expectation of this is what should be normal, which I think is really helpful. So I do want to talk very specifically about generative AI for a second, because we heard a lot about that in the last panel. And obviously, it's quite different from a lot of the traditional predictive tools. Currently, we do not really have a good explanation of the logic behind those tools, which can be challenging. And they're often built on foundational models that can sort of change without necessarily the developers who built on top of them really knowing exactly what's happening there. And we also think about traditional machine learning. They often did very narrow tasks, which you could say, did it do it right or not? It was sort of a yes/no answer. There was an accuracy measure there that could potentially be useful. But I think in generative AI, especially where there's much broader tasks, that's a less helpful metric. So how are y'all thinking about both the different risks of AI and then how to also measure that impact of AI?
That's a lot. That's a long conversation. So you're right about the deterministic or predictive AI. We've been doing that for quite some time. Matter of fact, the first AI-enabled device we approved was in 1995. There was not a whole lot of adoption because of the cost element to it, which is the same problem that we're seeing right now. But with generative AI, it becomes very different, right? Because what we've also seen in the industry is that the current capabilities that everyone is really talking about and excited about has been around for about 1.5 years. It was March of 2023 when ChatGPT 4 came out. And so all of a sudden what happened is that we flipped the traditional kind of product management upside the head and said, here's this great capability, let's go find problems to just go apply it to. And when you have an industry like healthcare, which is really strapped for capital dollars for emerging technologies, and people get blinded by the $4.5 trillion market size, but that's not the market size. That's not your addressable market. It's actually something like, you have to always ask the question, how much IT spend is a percentage of the actually revenue? And healthcare tends to be on the bottom end of that. Like top is like financial services, and it kind of shows based on your relationship with your finances and the bank itself. But healthcare is really around the 2.5% to 3%, which means that the dollars are actually about $135 billion annually speaking, which means that then you have to remove things like EHR, you have to remove things like back office systems. Every hospital has enterprise resource planning, human capital management, supply chain management. Now that number becomes even narrower, right? It's a very, very actually small sliver of that $135 billion in the annual market size. And so generative AI, the problem is that, we're trying to apply it to so many different areas. And I've heard, people even here talk about there's a lot of frogs that are being, sent our way, and we have to kiss all of them and validate whether they're going to actually turn into prints. And the problem with that is that you can't do that in a highly risky environment where you're applying it. And so I think there's going to be two sides of the coin that has to happen. One is Silicon Valley, which I'm from Silicon Valley, so I get to say the things like that, is that they're very idealistic in where they're going to apply all of this. But the reality is the demand signal has to come from hospitals to say, these are the problems that we're trying to address. And that's why I use that statistics around the demand supply issues, because labor shortage is a big problem. And so the question now becomes, well, with all of the things that you can apply this capability towards, with the finite amount of dollars that you have to spend, where do you start? Right? So generative AI, I think, the capability is there, but we have to effectively figure out how to drive value out of these things, because right now the cost associated to it is not necessarily resulting into a value. And that could be economies of scale as well. And so that's another issue that we have to run into. But I also think that we're in the very early stages of it. I'm very excited about this capability, but the reality is that we're going to have to be much more targeted and thoughtful around where we're prioritizing its implementation and integration into the healthcare system. And that's not going to happen on this side of the aisle. Our job is to make sure that they're safe and effective, right? And they're going to remain safe and effective. But in my opinion, it's the hospital systems that have to provide that demand signal to say, this is where we need this application. This is where we need capabilities to be applied to.
So, I think that one of the questions I have, and I'm going to turn to Melanie for a second, when we're thinking about generative AI also, and it fits into a little bit of what you were just saying, Troy, is when we're thinking about whether they're going to have a discriminatory impact, they could have a discriminatory impact on patients, but they also could have a discriminatory impact on the users, depending on how well ambient charting, for example, how well do they work for clinicians that maybe have speech differences, and then how do you think through what are some of the discriminatory impacts that we might be worried about there? You talked a little bit about privacy impacts there too, which I know you also had mentioned that you were concerned about. So we'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts there.
Disparate impact and privacy. You're allowed to laugh. That was kind of funny, right? Those are giant things. I think when we think about disparate impact, I think the truth of the matter is we as a healthcare system do, and I would give us a C+ to a B- on civil rights overall, notwithstanding AI. A lot of our institutions, they have the notices posted, they do the one and done training, and that's it. And we don't think about bias as we interact with our patients, whether they're LGBTQI or they're African American or it's a woman. And so I think we overall, there's a huge learning curve on this because we don't invest enough money and resources in it. And I get it, like, it's not the priority. It is just check a box and hope nobody files a complaint against us, right? And I'm such a small organization, I'm not going to go, into every hospital system and, look at it. It's just not possible.
But while you're here.
But, just kidding. But I think to that end, that's why we really try to do a lot of compliance work on the front end with organizations, because it's to everyone's benefit to make sure that folks understand what is required. Now, when you think about disparate impact, so what you said is exactly right? And we think about, I was listening to this podcast and it was talking about a tool that was detecting sepsis. And obviously a very serious problem and something that earlier intervention is immensely powerful. But what they found was that there was a different impact for Latino kids. And what they didn't realize in the initial look at it was not that Latino kids were healthier or that they were doing better when the testing, it was that they got care later because of a language access issue, right? And thinking things through like language access, we could spend a whole panel just on language access. It is 2024. We still have hospital systems in this country that don't translate things into Spanish. Everyone should be like, you're Josh, that's crazy. I understand this is a business school, but like that's like a basic service we should be providing to people. So I think there is a steep curve when we think about how we're using these tools and interacting with our patient base. And we have to make sure we understand the threshold requirements when it comes to what is discriminatory and what is not. But I also think thinking through terms, these are some of the things we talked about with Dr. Pantini is what are the best practices current systems are already doing, right? We talked about some of them. Transparency can be positive. My role, unlike this role, Steve's role, does not require transparency. That wasn't in part because we didn't think you should have it. Some of it was the way the original rule was developed, but it is an evidence of compliance. So if you're using transparency in these things, if you're talking to consumers, you're making sure consumers understand when you're using these tools, that can be a helpful way to have evidence of compliance. When you think about things like registries, who's using what in this hospital system, auditing those tools, making sure you're training staff, and that civil rights as a part of that, I think is really powerful. When we think about privacy, again, the law, HIPAA has not changed. And I don't disagree with you that there are limitations in the healthcare space, because I think most people think HIPAA, my healthcare, and everything that's on my device, and that's just not the case. However, the same questions these organizations are asking themselves, which again, we don't do a great job of, healthcare is at the front end of cybersecurity risk. Just look at my breach portal. Large breaches are up like almost double. And the number of affected individuals has gone up almost 900%. This year alone with Change Health, which went up 100 million people affected last week, is what they went from 500 to 100 million people. They're growing in size, the number of people they affect, and they're happening more and more regular. And some of that is due to ransomware when our own institutions aren't taking steps to protect themselves. So those same questions, when you start to use artificial intelligence, when you start to disclose protected health information, you have to have a business associate agreement in place. Otherwise, if you're working with a developer, that information is not protected by HIPAA. And if that developer gets hacked, if that developer has a breach, that information isn't protected, your system isn't protected, and those patients aren't protected. Thinking about risk analysis, thinking about who has access to this cloud, why? How long are we storing information in the cloud, why? Those kinds of questions that everyone, I don't know that you all run hospital systems, but those are the kinds of questions we should already be asking ourselves. And I think the fact that we're now interacting with possible development of these tools and use of these tools makes it a higher threshold. And we haven't done any new rules or regulations in this space with respect to it. It is an ongoing topic that we're thinking about, but I think overall, just reiterating what is already supposed to be done is really, really important because it's not.
So I actually think that was a great answer. We only have time for one last question. And I'm going to kind of go back to what you said and also what the first panel said, which is that things are moving so fast in this space. We could see really an enormous amount of change in the next 3 to 5 years. And so how can agencies start, like you just said, how do agencies start thinking about this? And what is the next challenge that really needs to be tackled in health policy? So if you had to imagine for a second, you had a research director for AI sitting in front of you, what would be the task list you would give me?
So my task list right now is cybersecurity. And it's already public, working on an updated cybersecurity rule. It's the first time we've done it in over 21 years. And we will have to think about artificial intelligence and its impact in cybersecurity across the systems. It's just breaches are happening so frequently across the healthcare system. It has to be at the top of our list. And then I think for me, again, we are a small office, so we try to go to partner with large academic medical institutes. We try to work with the large associations. We do a lot of travel into community. I have offices in 11 cities across the country. We're trying to have as big a footprint as possible, but the reality is we're small, so we'll never have a commercial like CMS on Medicare, right? That's just not possible. And so we have to think through, how do we get information out to consumers and patients so that they understand their rights? And how do we get information out to our hospital systems and our healthcare systems so that they are compliant with the law? And I think we're always looking for those opportunities. And that's one of the ways we're trying to leverage our sister agencies as they do a lot of work in this space and trying to tack on, slides with our stuff on it to make sure we're growing that footprint as big as possible. Because it is in everyone's interest for us to work together on this. It serves no one if a hospital system goes down because they have a breach. It serves no one if, to your point, the workforce doesn't get healthier because we're not enabling some of these tools, which we know help with provider burnout. So this is in everyone's interest to work on this. We have to do it in a way in which it's meaningful. We don't grow the disparities in our healthcare system.
Perfect, thank you.
I think the previous panel also addressed a lot of this. Is access to data definitely is a big problem in the United States. It's incredibly siloed. I don't think we take advantage of it. Of what is available. It was something like, actually, Eric said this, and I've read that same statistics in the World Economic Forum, that 97% of the data that is generated never gets touched, which means that it's just a cost center for many hospital systems that are hosting that data itself. And so effectively, we have to enable access to that data, because no matter what we say about AI, it's heavily dependent on good quality and representative, relevant data to be trained on. I think that's one issue that we have to resolve. We have to stop thinking about in terms of how to monetize this data and think about in terms of how do we actually improve the quality of the products that are coming in through data itself. And I would also say post-market monitoring. Whatever the medical device or medical product it is, we have phase 4 clinical trials, we have post-market studies for medical devices. But generally speaking, I don't think that we do it we do it in a very reactive way instead of a proactive way. And I think that we have to switch that a little bit and say that we have to continuously look at these types of devices or any kind of medical product and ensure that the quality, safety, and effectiveness is continuous within once it's deployed into the real world. So those are the two things that I would like to see.
Perfect. And I'm giving Steve the last word.
All right, I'm gonna try to keep it simple. How you show that the AI is better. And just to give another 30 more seconds on that, the reason why you still use Google for search, because you tried something else and it wasn't better. And you go back. And so just with a lot of these tools, the aspect that we'll face is workflow. And so as we saw with the electronic health record investments that we've made over the past 20 years, when you digitized a paper process that was a crappy paper process, you had a continued crappy digital workflow. And the same is potentially true with a lot of these tools, unless we can find ways to show that they're better. And we also are dealing with human behavioral culture changes of, but I've been doing this job this way for 10 years. And now this AI is doing 80% of the work that I was doing, so that hopefully you can work on more productive things. And being able to show that those are better for, however, as Amy mentioned, all the different methods and health services researchers that are far more intelligent than I. It doesn't need to be a randomized controlled trial, but it does need to demonstrate to people that there is a better way to do something. And how we generate that evidence, I think, is still somewhat lacking. It's not necessarily explainability. It's that we're going to help you do something different, and it's going to be better for you, and you're going to get more enjoyment or productivity, et cetera. We got to help people change, through that phase.
And goes back to that clinical impact and actual experience. of the tools at that point. So thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all joining us. This has been good. I think this has been a fabulous panel, so I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and come back up.
Okay, now I'm on. Okay, great. So thanks again for a terrific panel on a very challenging but just very important set of topics. You know, we could talk for a while about all the issues that are right in front of us, but are going to take some time and effort to resolve. But I think it's clear from this discussion that the time is now to be thinking ahead about the policy steps and working with industry. This is a public-private effort to get the most out of health AI. And that's, again, why it's a core part of Duke Margolis digital health activities. And I thank Christina Silcox again for leading those efforts. We heard about a number of important themes: transparency, kind of where we are today with a lot of the regulatory policy approaches, but moving from that to explainability and really trying to drive developing the evidence that can help increase confidence and help increase the impact of all of these tools. We heard about from a lot of the regulators, the importance of the demand side of this work, what healthcare organizations will ask for. And I think that is going to include burden reduction, administrative costs. I hope it can also include more value, better outcomes, lower cost, reduce disparities, not just more spending and not get, as Steve just ended up on, having what's paper now or a very costly, very limited use of all the digital information that's out there, not in a way that really increases value and health equity, but in a way that doesn't move us off the dime and see those kinds of productivity improvements and transformative impacts that Eric so eloquently described. And all that gets to the importance of, I guess I'll call it the AI era of the data layer in healthcare, the importance of using these tools to try to encourage getting that right and developing a way to turn all of these exploding amounts of data into real evidence that can be used. I could go on about some of the things that we've heard about, but one other thing that I did want to mention is the importance right now of healthcare organizations who are facing a lot of stresses and in very diverse circumstances, getting help and taking steps to assure assurance. Health AI assurance is the term, but it's really about kind of governance and deployment and thoughtfulness in how health AI is applied. The Institute has, Duke Margolis has just published a report related to this topic. We have a webinar coming up on that on November 18th. And if you aren't already in our on our emailing list, you can go to our website to get on that. While we're about to end the live portion of this event, if you stay on the line or come back later, there are several additional spotlight videos on what Duke is doing in the health AI space to try to advance and provide insights on some of these issues. And we'll also finally have a recording of this event on our website up in the next several days. So I want to thank all of our terrific speakers, brought together a range of really interesting and important perspectives, as well as our faculty, our staff, our students that have helped make this event and this whole line of work at Duke Margolis possible. And especially thanks to all of you here today, all of you who are joining us online, who are working so hard to help fulfill the tremendous promise of health AI. Thank you and safe travels.
At a time when health equity and social justice are more critical than ever, Duke University School of Nursing stands at the forefront of this movement. My name is Michael Carey. I'm a nurse and associate professor here at Duke. I'm also the equity scholar for Duke AI Health. I'm proud to lead efforts that harness the power of AI and advanced technology to create a healthcare system that provides ethical and equitable care for all. At Duke, my work focuses on eliminating bias in healthcare algorithms. AI must not perpetuate disparities. It should be used as a tool that drives fairness. Through research, education, and collaboration with healthcare leaders, we're advancing models that follow the Health Equity by Design framework, making sure that no patient is left behind. In education, we're designing training programs to ensure AI tools are deployed responsibly, enhancing both care quality and patient safety. Our interprofessional team that includes representatives from across the university, from nursing to medicine, therapy, bioethics, biostatistics, and engineering, work closely with healthcare system and academic leaders to build training programs that reflect real-world needs. This commitment culminated at our Path Fair Health workshop, where we train health professionals to identify and mitigate bias within clinical algorithms. This hands-on experience empowered participants to apply mitigation strategies to real-world case studies, shaping a healthcare system where every patient receives equitable and ethical care. Our recent publication in Health Affairs provides actionable strategies for eliminating bias in clinical algorithms. It responds to the Department of Health and Human Services' finalized rule against discrimination in clinical algorithms. This review offers a roadmap for researchers, developers, and policymakers to embed equity in every stage of the algorithmic lifecycle, from design and development to deployment in health systems. Equity in healthcare is not just about compliance. It's about building a future where bias has no place and every patient, no matter who they are or where they are, receives the care that they deserve. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing this journey towards a more just and equitable healthcare system.
Hi, my name is Will Ratliff. I'm an innovation program manager and data scientist with the Duke Institute for Health Innovation. We're a team that sits between the School of Medicine and the health system and are made up of data scientists, data engineers, qualitative research scientists, innovation program managers, among others. Our mission is to catalyze transformative innovation in health and healthcare at Duke. We've put more than 40 AI ML models into practice here since we were founded about a decade ago. For each of those solutions, we focus on working collaboratively with our clinical and operational leads to first identify the problem and opportunities to make an impact on clinical and process metrics that we identify with them. We co-develop and design and train and test our models retrospectively using data and then prospectively validate them in silent mode with our clinical champions to assess validity for a minimum viable product implementation. We then work to set up monitoring and governance as needed as we get ready to bring that solution live. We take it live with our clinical champions with an identified workflow. We collaborate with them to develop that aims to be low burden and high impact. Once we go live, we rapidly iterate on the technology and the process as needed under the guidance of our frontline care users. And then we measure and report on impact against those previously identified metrics of interest to our key stakeholders and to our frontline care users. I'd be glad to talk about any of this with you all, and thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Michael Zablanos, and I'm a professor in the Duke Pratt School of Engineering, an Amazon Scholar with Amazon Robotics, and I also lead the Healthcare Systems Optimization Program with Duke AI Health. In our research group, we study problems in control systems, optimization, and AI with a focus on robotics and autonomous systems and healthcare. In the healthcare space, we're particularly interested in optimization and AI methods that can provide us with a systems-level understanding of complex healthcare workflows that is needed to improve decision-making and, as a result, operational efficiency and delivery of patient care. While artificial intelligence models are already revolutionizing healthcare, they often fail to demonstrate impact when used by healthcare providers in a complex health system. The reason is that their development most often focuses on their predictive ability and does not factor in the effect that their use can have in complex healthcare systems that involve intricate and interconnected sets of decisions. An example are surgery duration and length of stay predictive models that have been widely studied recently as they promise to significantly improve hospital operations. The premise is that providing the most accurate surgery duration and length of stay information to human schedulers will allow them to make optimal operating room scheduling decisions that will increase surgery throughput, streamline OR utilization, and reduce surgery cancellations. But reality is that it is just not possible for human schedulers to evaluate all possible scheduling decisions in order to select the one that optimizes OR efficiency, more so given the multiple performance metrics and operational constraints that these decisions need to meet. In an effort to better understand and begin addressing this challenge, in collaboration with the Laboratory for Transformative Administration in the Duke Department of Surgery, we recently developed an OR scheduling optimization model that leverages past electronic health record data to improve the efficiency of OR utilization and the predictability of postoperative patient flow. We validated our optimization model on EHR data from Duke cardiothoracic, neurosurgery, and ambulatory departments and showed that it achieves significantly better performance compared to that of human schedulers in terms of throughput, OR utilization, waiting times, and daily patient discharges. Our goal moving forward is to go beyond OR scheduling and develop new systems-level methods to model, analyze, and control complex healthcare workflows by combining data and predictive modeling with decision sciences, such as mathematical optimization and AI. For example, we would like to answer research questions such as, is the current utilization of our available resources optimal given a desired set of performance metrics? And if not, how can we do better? What resources do we need to achieve a desired performance? And what are the trade-offs between different performance metrics, and which ones should we prioritize and when? To answer these questions, we need to bring together researchers, clinicians, and students from engineering, medicine, and the health system to develop new research and technology that is not only academically sound, but can also have an impact on operational efficiency and patient care, driving innovation in next-generation healthcare systems.
Hi, I'm Amanda Randalls, the Alfred Winburn Mordecai and Victoria Stover Mordecai Professor of Biomedical Sciences at Duke University. I work in the Biomedical Engineering Department, and my research focuses on developing large-scale, patient-specific models of blood flow. The problem we're addressing is to better predict and prevent adverse cardiovascular events before they happen. Cardiovascular disease remains one of the leading causes of death worldwide, and existing diagnostic tools often catch problems too late, or they can require invasive procedures. Our goal is to create digital tools that can give the clinicians the ability to intervene earlier and with high accuracy. So the way we're doing this is to create digital twins, specifically a vascular digital twin, like what you're seeing here. It's essentially a 3D model of a patient's blood flow. So to help you build intuition, this is a video that's going to show you an example simulation run. We're modeling that patient's blood flow in areas like the coronary arteries. These digital twins can already assess whether a lesion needs treatment by looking at a single heartbeat and the blood flow changes that you see across that heartbeat. But we really want to go further. By expanding our models to capture weeks or even months of blood flow data, so far we've gotten up to 4.5 million heartbeats. We can better understand long-term trends and identify risks earlier. What makes our work unique is our longitudinal hemodynamic mapping framework, which uses wearable devices and AI to create these long-term models. So we're able to drive these simulations from data we're collecting from commercial-grade wearables and see how a patient's blood flow is changing over time as they go about their normal daily activities. We can also sync this to Harvai, our virtual interactive treatment planner, that allows us to take these digital twins and let the doctor try out different treatment options before they ever enter the operating room. We can then simulate these different treatment options virtually and allow for more personalized and proactive healthcare. This approach not only addresses the immediate needs of individual patients, but it aligns with this larger vision of transforming healthcare through predictive modeling and real-time intervention.